Hey everyone, welcome back to Todd Shelnut here with CFI Pro, and we're wrapping up the FOIs today by talking about risk management. Now, if you're following along with me in your FAA book, you are at the Risk Management Chapter 9 in the book. And by now, if you follow along with each one of my lessons and you've reviewed the book, we have gone through the entire book after this video is done. Yay! This is a milestone, an accomplishment. Why is that an accomplishment? Because when you are in your check ride and the examiner says, applicant, have you read this book? You can honestly say, yeah, I have. And I actually took a course in it and heard somebody preach on it, and sure. So we're doing pretty good throughout this. I think we are. Let's start off by talking about risk management today and what it means to you as the instructor. So remember, every one of these things that we're talking about is what does it mean to you as the instructor? What does risk management mean to you? This whole entire book is about you, not anybody else, about you. What does risk management mean to you as the instructor? Well, we go right down the list of the way that it appears in the PTS, and the very first thing we have to do is talk about risk management. And I think with a good opening statement is this, to actually just talk about what risk management is. So if we use our handbook here, it says that risk management is the logical process of weighing the potential cost of risk against the possible benefits of allowing those risks to stand uncontrolled. And that, in simple words, means, what if you don't do anything about it? What would happen? Now, if you remember, what I told you earlier lesson was we talked about aeronautical decision making and we talked about risk management. Aeronautical decision making is the choice that you make right now. Risk management is the decision that you make in the future. So risk management is looking towards the future and seeing what's going to happen in the future. How do we do that? Well, we have a very simple process that only consists of 4 items, and it's called the risk management, or the principles of risk management. The very first thing we have to understand, and the acronym over here is AMI, A-M-A-I. The very first one is accept no unnecessary risk. And if we look at the book talks about unnecessary risk, and it says that every single risk has a corresponding return. And how can we as instructors better learn to manage risk? Well, if we don't study risk and look at situations where risk was a factor, then we can't. We can't effectively manage risk if we don't know what something looks like that is risky. So we have to be able to understand what risk looks like, to understand how risk is managed, in order for us to not accept it as an unnecessary risk. There are certain things in aviation that are risky, like the whole act of going flying. That's pretty risky. Losing an engine on takeoff, pretty risky. How do we manage that risk? Well, we manage that risk by training and by constantly thinking, okay, if I lost an engine right now, where would I go? If I lost an engine right now, where would I go? And if I lost an engine right now, where would I go? And you keep saying that until you get to a safe altitude. You're climbing out, you're climbing out, you're climbing out. Where would I go? Where would I go? Where would I go? And you're managing that risk for something that could possibly happen. And that's what we mean when we say accept no unnecessary risk. The second one says to make risk decisions at the appropriate level. So there are many different levels that we can make risk. The lowest possible level to assume risk is, or to identify the risk, is single pilot. So if you're dealing with single pilot resource management, that's the lowest possible level. You're the shot caller, you're looking at everything. You're looking at the airplane, you're looking at the plan, the plane, the pilot, the programming, all of the 5 Ps you're 100% responsible for. But if you have other people in the mix, then it's a little bit easier. But who is ultimately responsible for it? The captain, the PIC, the ultimate person who is responsible for it. And you may actually see this, like if your company has a flight ops or a scheduler who is really trying to get the mission done, and they're trying to push you to do it, but the level of risk management is only going to lie with the person who is ultimately responsible for making that decision, which is always the captain. The next thing is accept risk only when the benefits outweigh the cost. Now, sometimes this can be done, and sometimes it could not be done, but you have to at least identify the risk. So you're going to have to actually sit down and either write them down or either think about them and make a mental note, but know what the risks are, and then have something that sits on the other side of the scale. You imagine like those legal scales where you kind of tipping the balance of the legal scale or balance the legal scale. You want to be able to balance that scale. So if you have something over here that's a risk and the scale starts to balance, over here because it's pretty heavy with risk, you want to have something that's going to balance those scales. So no matter what you find risky, you need to have something that kind of balances it. Like for instance, I've done some North Atlantic crossings in single-engine airplanes. And how do I manage those risks? Well, I fly airplanes that had a parachute on it, which was nice. I had a raft. I had a life preservers. I had a cold weather suit, a dry suit. I had personal locator beacons around me and all different type of things, and filed flight plans, and I managed that risk. So if anything should have happened, I can minimize the odds of me not making it through that mission through the art of me planning throughout that mission. So accept the risk only when the benefits outweigh the cost. And the last one for the AME acronym is going to be to integrate the risk management into planning at all levels. And this really means that everyone that's associated with it should be able to identify these operational hazards. So everyone should be trained in the art of risk management. However, when it comes to the flight instructor, you're kind of like a one-man or one-person show. So you're just the one that's kind of making all the decisions. But there could be other things down the line, the opportunities that you have in which you have many different levels of that you would have to weigh that as. But, if you look at the book on page 9-3, it gives some pretty good things. It says that the risks are more easily assessed and managed in the planning stages of an operation. And so at that particular level, you can kind of look at it and go, well, I think this is a pretty good deal. At what level would it not be good to do that? Well, it'd be like en route, and you haven't really thought about it. You just kind of jumped in the plane and went. But every person that's involved at every level of the flight or every stage of the flight has to address this risk. Because remember, this is very dynamic. This whole art of risk management is incredibly dynamic. It changes all the time. So that's going through each one of those. So how do we want to gather our thoughts around this as a flight instructor? Well, the very first thing that we want to do is we want to follow the risk management process. And the risk management process is identified on page 9-3. And it says here that the risk management process is a simple process which identifies operational hazards and takes reasonable measures to reduce the risk of personnel, equipment, and the mission. Which means that someone has actually had to sit down and actually think through this thing and identify these risks and what they should or should not do. And as a flight instructor, you're constantly mitigating risk. If you remember during the first part of the FOIs, I told you how the aviate, navigate, communicate changed. And now it's aviate, navigate, communicate, and mitigate. They really want you to mitigate that risk. The FAA really is putting a lot of emphasis on mitigating this risk because it's so incredibly important for you to think ahead and not just do things on a whim. So it's very important for you to actually do this. This acronym that we have here, IMSAFE, as I think I like to put it that way, just follows right along the sequence of letters there, and you can follow along with me on page 9-3. You see the very first thing there that it says is we want to identify the hazard, ID the hazard. So what is the problem? What is going on? Well, there's some weather. All right, we've identified the weather, as a hazard. And so let's look at that, identifying the weather as a hazard and how will we do it. Well, what's the risk? Well, you are probably able to name a lot of the risk associated with flying in the weather. Well, what kind of weather is it? Well, it's let's be very specific. It's low ceilings, and it's lower ceilings are right at your personal minimum. So your personal minimums are 3,000 foot ceilings, and they're right at like 3,100 foot ceilings. So you're right there at your minimum, and so the risk associated with that could be that you may get into some precipitation. Is that okay for your airplane? I don't know. If you're flying a Diamond DA-20 with a wooden prop, or any airplane with a wooden prop, precipitation is not that good for a wooden propeller. It'll just chew it to pieces. What if the cloud deck lowers unexpectedly? Is that a problem? Well, yeah, you could possibly have a CFIT situation. So I'm getting into these things. And sometimes when you first start this, you actually are truly like sitting down and like writing this stuff out. Eventually, it'll come pretty fast. These things like 3P model and 5Ps and other items like that, a lot of the times we don't just simply just go, okay, detect that something has changed, estimate the need. No, we don't normally do that. Normally it just it just fires pretty quickly, and we're able to make this decision and not have to kind of think through the process like that. That's what's good about a lot of these decisions. But the good thing about risk management is that you have time. Unlike ADM, which we're trying to snap through it pretty quickly. The good thing about this is you actually have time to deal with it because it's very dynamic and you can see it before it happens. So once we've identified and assessed the risk, next thing we want to do is analyze risk control measures. So what can we do to minimize risk control? Well, I'm going to take an airplane that has weather radar. I'm going to take my ADS-B module with my iPad so I can see the weather on my iPad. I'm going to use flight following so I can see if there's weather that's going to be bad. I'm going to check the weather along the route because there's the dynamics of the weather as I go. I'm going to have an out. I'm going to say, well, at this particular point, I'm going to come back, or I'm going to divert to this airport. But you have all these risk control measures. The next thing would be just to make control decisions. Now, of course, sometimes you may not have to do this because a part of managing the risk control or having to these control decisions is something actually transpiring. So sometimes you may have a risk, but it may not come to fruition, and you may not even have to deal with it, but be prepared to make those control decisions. And if we do that, then we have to implement the risk control, and that comes next, and that would just basically just be to do what you have planned to do. And then supervise and review. So after you've made the decision, I'm going to divert. Is it okay? Is it looking better? Is the weather looking better? Because I have to look ahead. I have to check the weather. Is the radar looking better now? I mean, what is it better? Did the weather move? Is this still a logical choice? If not, I've got to manage the risk a little bit further. So that is what we call the risk management process. I think that you're going to find out that there's a couple of things, like I started off saying at the very first part of this. When you have things such as experience, common sense, and any analytical tool that you can use, you're going to find out this is a lot easier to do. But the bottom line is that unless you have that experience and you can see where the risks are, or somebody has told you, or you read an article, you watch a video, you do the research, you will not be able to manage risk because you don't know that it's risky. You know, I was teaching my son about life and about managing risk. And I said, if you see a dog barking and he's tied to a chain and he's stretching the chain to the limit and he's growling, barking, is that a good dog to go up and go drop to your knees below it and start petting the dog? And he said, of course not. And I go, well, how do you know that? He goes, well, the dog will attack you. I go, have you ever been attacked by a dog? He said, no. I go, okay. Have you ever seen someone get attacked by a dog? No. Well, then how do you know that has certain risk associated with it? And he says, well, it's just a lot of common sense that if I see that dog and I can deduce that the dog's angry because he's growling and he's barking and he's on a chain and he's stretching the chain to its limit or the rope to its limit, I can deduce that that's probably not a good idea to be there. So a lot of this stuff that we're going to talk about is common sense. But there's things that you actually have to know. If you're an IFR person and you're flying into a cloud, what type of cloud is it? Is it a stratonimbus? Well, that may not be a bad cloud to fly through. Matter of fact, I love flying through stratonimbus clouds. To me, it's like very peaceful and very smooth. But cumulonimbus, I don't like flying through cumulonimbus. I don't like flying through towering cumulus. How do I know that? Well, because I've had my headset knocked off, and I've had a chip in my tooth. No, I don't have a chip in my tooth, but I've known pilots who had some damage either to their tooth or to their top of their head. I had a ball cap on one time that had that little button in the top of it, and I hit some big turbulence, and I went boom right up to the top of the airplane, and I had that hat on, and my headset band was on top of that hat like that, and it drove that little button in the top of my head. So whenever I go into turbulence now, I strap tight, and I hold on to something so that way I don't go up. And I take that hat off if I have a hat with a button on it. Luckily, I have aviator hats and ball caps, and I don't have that little button on the top anymore. But I learned my lesson through experience, and that's how I better manage that risk. Let's move on. So when we're managing risk, I think one of the good things to understand is the severity of the risk and then the probability of the risk. So severity would be the extent to the possible loss. So if it's a very low severity, it's probably nothing's going to happen. If it's a big severity, then somebody may lose a life. That would be at the upper end of it. Then you have the probability. Low end of probability, probably not going to happen. High end probability, it's probably going to happen multiple times throughout the flight or throughout the event that you're trying to manage. So what are we really trying to talk about here? Well, let's look at each one of these. I'm going to put each one of them here. We're talking about the likelihood of an event happen, or the probability. So you would have probable, occasional, remote, and improbable. And again, we've already talked about this briefly, but probable means it's probably going to happen several times, all the way down to improbable here, of which the event is highly unlikely to occur. And you put whatever scenario you want to in there. I could name any scenario. Okay, a vacuum pump is going to go out. What's the odds of a vacuum pump going out? Well, in some airplanes, it's actually pretty readily. Piper Seminole. I think vacuum pumps go out all the time. I think it's actually probably somewhere around the remote to occasional, or occasional to probable. Probably occasional, I would say. It goes out a pretty good bit. And so you could have a situation where you say, I'm going to go on a flight and I only have one vacuum pump left because the other one's bad. I only have one vacuum pump. But I'm going to do a daytime mission about 12 miles away, 15 miles away to a maintenance facility to get the vacuum pump replaced on one engine. How do I feel about the risk associated with this? And that is much easier to deal with than, let's say, that I have to fly 100 miles away with one vacuum pump and it's night IFR. You see where we're going here, don't you? Absolutely you do. But then we also have what we call the severity. And here we have here catastrophic, critical, marginal, and negligible. So catastrophic means there's probably going to be a loss of life. If we have negligible, is whatever. Map light burns out on a day flight. Okay. And so what? Nobody cares. And so you're working with your student and you're like, student, how can I help you to understand this? Sometimes it's better just to kind of put them right where they need to be in regards to thinking. And so if you show them something like this would actually probably help them to better understand it. If you're looking at this chart here, you can see that this chart would give them something, a real benefit to say, I'm going to tell you this story, and you find out whether or not you think this would be a safe flight. And I think the green, yellow, and red really kind of make it a good thing to do. So there is a chart like this. This is found in the Risk Assessment Handbook. It's not like some chart I made up or anything, but you can find it in the Risk Assessment Handbook. It does also appear in your in your chapter 9 here on page 9-5 in the top left-hand corner. So that's a good chart to have as well. So the next thing we're going to talk about here is actually how to successfully mitigate that risk. And if you're looking here, we're on page 9-5 at the bottom. And it says here in the book, it says risk assessment is only part of the equation. After determining the level of risk, the pilot needs to mitigate it. And that means manage. Mitigate is manage. Manage the risk. How can we manage the risk? On-board managing for the risk. And so the way that we manage the risk is we just basically take action against it. Very simple. We just take action against it. For instance, let's say that if we had a non-instrument rated pilot, and on a day that this non-instrument rated pilot wants to fly, that we have marginal weather that day. Okay? Non-instrument rated pilot that wants to go flying, marginal weather for the day. How can we reduce these risks associated with this marginal VFR flight? What are some options that we have? Well, let's name off some. One, we could wait for the weather to clear. Two, we could take along an instrument-rated pilot with us. Three, we could delay the trip. We could cancel the trip, or we could go old school and drive it. So that is mitigating, managing. What are we going to do? How are we going to do this? And that is the literally, it's not, I really kind of consider it an art. I think there's an art to risk management, especially when we're talking about single pilot resource management. Man, that is absolutely 100% an art. It's actually in the definition of that. If you look in this book, it's actually in the definition of single pilot resource management. So how do we start? Well, the very first thing we do is we're going to do the IMSAFE checklist. We're looking on page 9-5. It's on the right-hand side. Most of you know this already. When you manage risk, you say, okay, I'm sick. I'm on medication. I really had a crappy day at work. I've worked a very long shift. I'm quite tired. I had a very good drunk last night. I drank a lot. I'm probably still a little bit hungover. And I haven't eaten in the past 10 hours. So those are literally a 100% no-go decision to be made. And these are the things that we learn early on in our training. So you have to push this onto your client. You have to say, what do you keep rubbing your head for like that? You have sinus problems today? Yeah, just a little bit. Yeah, I noticed you kept rubbing your head right there. You kept rubbing your eyes and everything. It just looks like you're having sinus problems. Yeah, I'm having little sinus problems. We may not need to go on this flight today. We may need to take a little break from going on this flight. The student will want to push it because they're with you. You have to go back to this FOIS thing and just say, you know what? There's factors that affect perception. And if you remember the acronym called G-STEP, there's one thing in there that says physical organism. If you're not up to par with your physical organism, it's going to make you very difficult to learn. See how all this stuff plays together? It all folds back on top of one another. This is all very important stuff. You just have to learn it. You have to have somebody tell you why it's important to learn. What's the best way for us to know if the medication that we're on is actually something that we should or should not be on? The FAA has a terrible site. Terrible site for medication. I would not use their site. I would use AOPA's site. You can actually put in the name of your medication and just spit out the answer. If in doubt, even after that, call your AME, your Aviation Medical Examiner. Do not contact the FSDO because those guys there are not medical people. Deal with someone who's in medicine. I would definitely go to the AOPA's website. I'm going to put the AOPA's medical look up your medicine thing down here in the notes below this. Make sure you take a look at that. Stress. So many different levels of stress. Physical stress, physiological stress, physical stress, or psychological stress, excuse me. Physical, physiological, and psychological stress. These are all big, huge things that we have to deal with. And we've already talked about these stressors. We talked about them in our last lesson with the 3 levels of that and the ways we can combat that. So it's up to you to ensure that your client is not suffering from any of these. Remember, this is a flight instructor's course. This is about teaching. It's not about you, folks. It's about you taking care of your client. Not about you. It's not all about you. It's about you becoming a better instructor to train your student better. Flight instruction is not just riding in the right-hand seat building flight time. Jesus. That's the reason why we have more accidents than what we should. We would have a greater reduction in accidents and incidents and occurrences if we trained like we fly and fly like we train. And we don't. We don't, because people think the risk management is boring and that it just comes natural. And I'm like, no, it does not. You have to have the experience. You have to have the training. You have to know how to mitigate this stuff. It does not come natural. Trust me, I know. I had to learn the hard way. I did a lot of single pilot stuff for years and got the bejesus scared out of me. And I had to learn from actually making mistakes. You don't want to learn that way. That's the hardest way to learn. You need to be there to have somebody help you to manage the risk. Alcohol. Folks, what can I tell you about this? 0 tolerance. Okay? Most airlines are up in the 24-hour range. Most pro flight departments are in the 24-hour range. The FAA says 8 hours bottle throttle, which I think is pretty lax. I think it should at least be 12. How many drunks have you tied on in your lifetime? I know for a fact that I've drank enough that 8 hours later I was still intoxicated. Not proud of it. I'm just saying it happens when you're young. You want to go out there and do a lot of these things and party hard, and you know what is the age of the typical flight instructor nowadays? You see where I'm going with this? You know, you're young, you want to go out there, you want to turn one on, you can't go the next morning with your client, and you can't have your client come out there either. 8 hours, 0.04, fit to fly condition. Fatigue. This is a big one. I think one thing you must center on is yourself. Are you fatigued? If you are, you can't go flight instruct. And the second thing is monitoring your student to see if they're fatigued. And the way you do that is you simply just have conversation with them. You talk to them. As with anything that we have here, if you just simply talk to your client, you can figure out a lot of stuff. If you think, you look at them, you can tell they're sick, or you can tell they don't feel good, or you can tell they're in a bad mood. Are you suffering from defense mechanisms? Is your physical organism messed up? Are you going to be able to properly gather the perceptions today that I'm trying to teach you? Blah, 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 blah. You have to be trained on this. You are the one who is trying to become the instructor. So you have to do this. You have to practice what you preach. Eating. Yeah, this is a big one, and I think this actually goes a little bit with eating and dehydration as well. But in essence, this is a pretty big one. You just simply ask, hey, are you properly nourished? And when's the last time you've eaten? Sometimes you have to watch what you eat. Are you going to go up and do spin training for a person that predominantly has a weak stomach? Yeah. Stomach? Yes. Then you probably don't need to go by and get a Philly cheesesteak before you go out and fly. Just saying. As well as actually, staying, going for long periods of time without eating. That can also have some negative impact on you. If your stomach's growling and you're very hungry, it's going to be taking your mind off where you need to be, and that's not good. So I think that the way that we learn how to do this most is by using something called the PAVE Checklist. So the PAVE Checklist, P-A-V-E. So we have our pilot in command. We're going to check the pilot in command. How do we do that? IMSAFE checklist. Pretty simple. Then we have aircraft. How do we do that? Well, there's a lot of different ways. Is the aircraft suitable and equipped for the trip? Ultimatum flames, flaps, grab cards, AV8s, aero, pre-flight inspection. What else can we do to make sure the aircraft is suitable? A lot of things. What about the environment? What about things like weather, airspace, airports, day, night, terrain? All those things are ways that you can check the environment. And external pressures. External pressures are usually just a couple of feet behind you. The biggest external pressure, your passengers. And your passengers, I'll tell you, they can be the biggest one, pushing you to get where you want. Thank God we don't have that happen in the airline industry or in the corporate industry, in the 135 industry. It is what it is on that. We can just tell them what it is. Tell them no. But if you're out flying for a small corporate department or by yourself, this becomes a pretty big deal to deal with. So you have to be the determining factor as that's what you're going to do. Another way that we can manage risk and be able to handle things is by really getting a grip on this ADM thing. So the risk management, we looked ahead, but then boom, something happens in flight, and now we have to manage the now. And we do this through what we call our 3P model. So the first thing is we have to perceive that something needs to be acted on. I see a oil temperature light. I see it. The next thing is process. Is there a need for me to act on that light? Yes. Have I trained enough to know what to do when that light comes on? No. Well, is there something that would tell me what to do if that light comes on? Yes. POH. Grab out the POH and you follow through the POH and you do what the POH says when that red light comes on, and that is called our perform. So perceive, process, perform, pow, right there. Make sure that you know that, and a lot of times it just comes natural, but you have to say to yourself, I see this looks wrong. Do I know what to do? If anything goes on inside the plane and you don't know what to do, then you're not going to be good at this 3P model. What do I see most with flight instructors that is really upsetting to me? I'll go through the emergency procedures in the POH, and they haven't seen 75% of the emergency procedures in the POH. That is, let me tell you that's disgusting. That is terrible. That means your instructor, if you're in the same boat, your instructor did a terrible job. A terrible job of telling you how to mitigate some of these things and handle some of these things that could possibly hurt you very badly. I don't want to say that other word because I don't want to be dismal. But yeah, you could hurt yourself or hurt others pretty bad if you don't know what to do. Folks, as a flight instructor, if you haven't picked up any pilot's operating handbook or a pilot information manual or an aircraft flight manual and turned to chapter 3 and looked at all of the emergency procedures associated with that airplane and the expanded procedures on them as well, you're doing yourself a gigantic disjustice. Please make sure that you do not do that. You don't get caught out there with your pants down, your proverbial pants down, and that you research and find out this thing. This is what's going to make you very good at risk management. So the bottom line is this. How are you going to tell your student and teach them about this? This seems like a pretty complex thing. Not really. There's a one-stop shop that we can actually go to do that. And that is this little thing here called the Personal Minimums Checklist. And as you can see there's the Personal Minimums Checklist. And what I would do is and I'll put a link to this in the bottom, but what you want to do is use the Personal Minimums Checklist to teach your student what to do. When I'm teaching someone throughout an entire course, I'll have them go through about 5 to 10 of these, and I'll have them change it. So you can see here on the front you have just a part to fill out there and who it belongs to and a bunch of other stuff there. And on the second page, you can see there where it says pilot, aircraft, and environment. And it helps you to be able to see where you are. I used to love asking people questions like, what is your personal minimums for today's flight? And most of them would probably just say visibility and ceilings. But look how much, and I say, let me finish that up. Visibility and ceiling, and then if I really pushed it, maybe they would talk about crosswind. Now I can say, look how many things are on this list. Holy cow, look at all those things you have to consider. And if you're instrument rated, a lot of things to consider. If you haven't considered some of these things, I highly recommend you consider it. Because it only helps you to get better as a pilot if you know these things and you're able to mitigate it better. Probably one of the better things to understand too is to be able to be very, 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 very situationally aware. And being situationally aware is an art form in itself. The accurate perception and understanding of all the factors and conditions within the four fundamental risk elements that affect safety before, during, and even after the flight. Looking down at the bottom of 9-9 in your book, carried over to 9-10 is where we're going to talk about situational awareness. The more situationally aware you are, the better your risk management process will be. Single pilot resource management, over on page 9-11, kind of wrapping up the chapter here with this single pilot resource management. The art and the science of managing all the resources available to a single pilot to ensure the successful outcome of the flight. I had a student ask me one time in a ground school, he says, well, if this one's for the single pilot, what about the married pilot? And I said, sit down and be quiet, please. Stop interrupting the class. Single pilots. Yeah, so if you're the only pilot on board, okay, you could have a full airplane full of people, and if you're the only pilot, that's called single pilot operation. I have had people ask me one time, so does that mean I'm the only person on the plane? I go, no, good question. Excellent question, but that is not what it means, single pilot resource management. And you can get very, very good at single pilot resource management by doing these simple things here. Boom, the 5 P's. Plan, plane, pilot, passengers, and programming. What do we talk about each one of these? One, first off, the plan. What's the mission at hand? Remember that the mission can sometimes be dynamic. Sometimes the mission can change. And we need to keep that very, very close to ourselves, that the plan can change and I may have to change what I have to do. The plane are the systems suitable for the mission. It's what you're trying to do. There is icing conditions along our route, and your airplane does not is not FICI, flight approved for flight into known icing conditions. Don't want to take that plane if it's not FICI. If there's any projected or forecasted icing conditions along your route, that plane is not suitable for the mission. The pilot, have you done your IMSAFE checklist? Well, kudos to you. You're almost ready to go. Passengers. Tell you something about passengers. Remember this one phrase. Accommodate, but don't sacrifice your personal minimums. Accommodate, but don't sacrifice your personal minimums. It is what it is. If you're not going, you're not going. If you arrive alive, your passengers will arrive alive, everybody will thank you. The programming. Are you familiar with the airplane? I'm going to tell you, I've got into airplanes before. It was the same platform of airplane I've been flying. Like jumping in one Pilatus to another Pilatus, or jumping in one King Air to another King Air, or one 172 steam gauge and then jumping into a G1000, or vice versa. The programming is everything. You got to understand that sometimes, in order for you to stay ahead of the airplane, you have to actually know about the airplane. The art of flying sometimes is not necessarily enough to get you out of it. And if you look over these items of what I've told you about, and you study these things, Risk Management Handbook, very small handbook, probably less than 1/4 of an inch thick, very easy read. It's not that bad. Chapter 9 of this book, you can see we're done with the book. There, we've gone through the 5 P's, and that's it with that. All the way over to 9-16, done. You have to get good at teaching these skills. As instructor, your requirement is to teach. And you have to be able to understand all these things. If you don't understand them, there's no way you can teach them to anybody, folks. And hands down, I'm telling you the 100% truth. You've got to understand it. I did not understand this for a long period of time. It took me years to get on top of this. It doesn't take you that long as you have someone helping you along the way. When you get finished talking about this in the check ride, as you can see, this is not a long lesson. It's probably right at 40 minutes or so. And that's me gabbing and putting a lot of emphasis on top of things and having stories. You don't need to have all that stuff in your check ride. You know, just basically give them what they're asking for in regards to the PTS, and you should be fine. I think most students probably spend around 20 minutes or so or 30 minutes talking about this in the check ride. Don't get too lost on time either. If you're really kind of concentrating on, well, Todd, how long should this take me? Do not ask that question. You just basically do it until you're finished. Let me give you one big piece of advice, folks. One price, one check ride. Don't let a 20-minute risk management versus a 30-minute risk management presentation cost you another $1,000. I'm Todd Shellnutt with CFI Pro. Thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate all of my patrons, all my subscribers for my YouTube channel. Thank you very much for being a part of this. You're basically what drives me to get in here and do these whenever I have the time to do it, and it's getting more sparse by the minute. But I will continue to do this. We will continue to go through this entire it was supposed to be 8 weeks. It's running much longer, but it is what it is. My schedule's what it is. I over-talked myself when I first came into this. I thought it was manageable, but it's not been manageable for me with my full-time job. Anyway, thank you so much for being a part of this. Todd Shellnutt with CFI Pro. See ya.